So, Vanakkam, என் பேர் அன்பழகன். So, my name is Anbalagan. I am going to talk about the engineering seismology, the first class on hazard and preparedness. The hazard, what is mean by hazard? Actually, the hazard is actually a danger or risk. Okay, so when we call it in the noun, so the same thing if you call it in the verb, it says like say something is tentative way or put something at risk being a lost. Okay, so the hazard is basically any event which causes some kind of disturbance or the problems to the living things. Okay, is called as a hazard. Okay, so this hazard can be categorized as a two major category. One is the man-made hazard, the another one is the natural hazard. So, what is mean by man-made hazard? Anything which is made by the human being which causes so loss or damage to the living things is called as a man-made hazard. For example, somebody excavate a pipeline or a pit and leave it without closing, then somebody going there and unknowingly fall on the pit which causes a hazard or risk to that particular person. So, that is called as a man-made hazard. So, the man-made hazard is like any hazard which is created by the man is called as a man-made hazard. The other hazard is natural hazard. So, this natural hazard is anything which occurs due to the nature system. Okay, so, due to the change in the climate or movement of the earth or rotation of the earth, so or the falling of something which is naturally occurs. So, those kind of things is called as a natural hazard. So, this hazard basically even though we call it as a risk, but all the hazard may not be a disastrous. So, then what is mean by disastrous? So, the disaster means a sudden accident or natural catastrophe that causes a great damage or loss of life. So, any hazard which causes the more loss and damage is called as a disaster. Okay. So, for example, the flood occurs, you will get only a small thick height of the water or 2 inch water is occurring due to the rain. So, that is a flood. So, that is a natural hazard. Okay. So, if that flood sometimes flows very higher level and causes damage to the house and human being and animals, so that flood is called as a disastrous. So, that is how the hazard and disastrous we should differentiate. So, in this class we try to understand what are the different type of natural hazard, okay, so present in the world and how these natural hazards are grouped. Okay, so, how you can prepare yourself to overcome this kind of natural hazard. Okay, so, this will be the first part of our engineering seismology course. So, where we will be discussing about the hazard and preparedness. So, if you look at the global level, okay, so if you divide the entire world into 5 continents like the Africa, America and Asia and Europe and Oceanic. So, with the different color you can see that the green is Asia, purple is Europe and light green is Oceanic and then the red is America. Okay. So, if you look at the 5 division, the number of disaster happened, okay, so up to 2009 you can see that. So, in Asia you can see that 132 natural disasters are reported in Asia and 79 natural disaster events are reported in America and then about 60, okay, so natural disaster event reported in Africa and 16 reported in the Oceanic and 47 reported in the Europe. Okay. So, the number of event occurred if you compare a 5 continent, this continent more or less with the size, okay, you can compare the size. The number of natural disaster occurring in the Asia is comparatively large when compared to any other continent. So, when you compare the number of events, we will talk about how these events causing the economic and as well as the number of people die, that is a mortality. Okay. So, if we divide the 5 continent with the number of people die due to these natural hazards, you can see that 68% of the people die due to the natural hazard in Asia and then about 11% of the people die in America, 7% of the people die in Africa and 8% of the people die in Oceanic and then 6% of the people die in Europe. So, you can see that the number of percentage of the people die, okay, due to this kind of natural hazard, basically less in Europe, okay, then followed by the Oceanic, and then followed by the Africa, and then America, and very large number you can find in the Asia. So, there may be reason for this. Actually, you may be knowing that the most of the Asian countries are basically located on the plate boundaries, and most of the climate, okay, so where you can see that very drought as well as a large amount of the wind, and then the people living close to the sea is very large in Asia. Okay. It is not only that, there is another reason which we will be discussing in the little later. So, why the Asia is getting a more number of people die when compared to other developed countries. So, if you look at a economic loss, okay, so the same number of event which causes more death in Asia, but if you look at a economic loss, you can see that the Asian continent has only a 34% of the economic loss. So, when you look at the economic loss in America, which is basically 33%, if you look at a US, which is basically 23%, so rest of them are like 5% and a smaller amount. You can see that the Europe and America, okay, so even though the number of events are less, like 50% closer is less than the Asia, and then the number of people die actually is very large extent less than the Asia, but the economical loss basically more or less similar. So, the reason behind it that actually one is that our currency variation, second the cost of living, okay, per capita income for the people. So, since Asia, most of the Asian countries are developing countries or underdeveloping countries. So, our economical per capita income is low, because of that our economical loss due to natural disaster is less, okay, when compared to developed regions like America and Europe. So, this gives you a glimpse of idea, okay. So, even though we face more number of natural disaster, but our economical loss is very close to the developed countries, but the mortality rates are 5 times 6 times the larger than the developed countries. So, this natural hazard, okay, can be broadly categorized as a 5 type. So, what are those 5 type basically? So, these 5 types basically a biological hazard, geophysical hazard, climatological hazard, hydrological hazard and meteorological hazard. So, what is mean by biological hazard? Biological hazard is the hazard which is basically happens due to the biological changes in the world, okay, for epidemic, okay, insect infection and animal attack. So, you may be aware that so there was animals which destroying the farmer land as well as the cultivated kind of. So, those kind of hazard is called as a biological hazard. So, the remaining hazard, okay, so called as a hydrometeorological hazard, which is like climatological like drought, extreme temperature, wildfire, hydrological flood and wet mass movement, and then meteorological storm. So, these are all related to water and climate. So, that is why this is called as a hydrological hazard. The other hazard is called as a geophysical hazard, which is like happens due to geophysical activity of the earth and around the earth, which is called as a earthquake, volcano and dry mass movement. So, in our class we are going to discuss more of geophysical hazard. In particularly we will be going to discuss in geophysical hazard how among these 3 which is dominating and which one is causing more damage. So, what we should do to minimize that is our engineering seismology scope. So, if you look at a number of natural disaster happened from 2000 to 2017 and then with the continent wise and then global wise. So, this is what the picture you have seen in the previous bar chart, okay, the cumulative one you can see. So, if you look at the number of event with respect to each category of the hazard, and you can see that the Asia basically if you look at a Asia. So, you can see that in the Asia the number, okay, is considerably high when compared to any other continent. Okay. The number of natural hazard occurs in Asia is much larger than the any other continent. So, this is naturally occurring, okay. We do not have any control to prevent this natural hazard. Only thing we can minimize disaster due to this kind of natural events. Okay. So, if you see the percentage of the share by the disaster subgroup by continent in 2008, this graph was prepared. You can see that all these 4 category of hazard is listed. So, and then each continent wise you can see. For example, the geophysical hazard, which I told that we will be going to discuss in detail. So, the number of geophysical hazard, like for example, earthquake, volcano, and then the dry landmass moving, that is landslide. So, occurring in Asia is basically 58%. So, if you look at the other continent, for example, Africa is very small, and then the America, it is like so the moderate. So, then Europe also it is small, and then oceanic is also small. So, the number of geophysical hazard occurring in Asia is much more than the any other continent. So, if you look at the other hazard, which is like for example, the meteorological and hydrological. So, you can see that the highest number is reported in the meteorological hazard in America. As you know that there is always a cyclone, okay, which is causes a huge loss and then disaster in the America. That is why there is a number of this one. So, similarly, if you look at the other continent, we are not very less, but we are slightly less than the America. You can see that the Asia is actually having the meteorological hazard of around 38%, okay, which is slightly less than the US, but comparatively more than the other continent. So, like that then the climatology. So, climatology our Asia we have actually 28%. So, where you can see that Africa you have the large amount, because there is a huge amount of the climate difference within the Africa continent. You can see the 31%. So, where we are in 28, and then America is very less, and then Europe actually it is a 28. So, equal to Asia. The oceanic region, so this hazard basically the climate and other things also very less. So, as this continent is basically located on the eastern part of the globe, okay. So, which is causes basically less hydrological, meteorological and climatological hazard, but among the this category basically the geophysical hazard in oceanic regions are the larger when compared to any other hazard, okay. So, for this hazard, okay, this hazard how much the disaster subgroup, okay, percentage of the share the victim of the people. So, let us see that we have seen that we have the very large geophysical hazard, but relatively lower the meteorological hazard, but the number of people die due to this hazard. If you take a geophysical hazard, Asia 100% of the people die. For example, in the 1 year there is 100 people died in the globe. That 100 people died because of the geophysical hazard, mostly from the Asia. So, if you look at the same way the meteorological hazard, the 100 people die in the globe, the Asia is going to only 72% people die in the Asia, remaining people are distributed to basically US, so then little bit in the Africa. So, similarly the hydrological hazard we have less number of people, and climatological hazard also we have very high. So, in overall all these 4 type of natural hazard, okay, which causes a disaster, the Asia is experiencing a largest people die or largest people affected by this kind of hazard, okay. So, the similar way we see the economic loss, okay. So, if you look at the economic loss, so we have seen that all these 4 hazard basically occurs, okay, and then only this is large amount of the victims are from the Asia. So, if you look at the economically, we have only the geophysical and climatical hazard causes more economic loss than a your hydrology and meteorological hazard. So, the meteorological and hydrological hazard causes a more loss in the US economic loss when compared to other part of the world. Okay. But we are more affected by the geophysical and climatic loss with respect to human loss as well as the economical loss. So, if you look at 2007 natural disaster global preparation occurrence by the major disaster group, okay, you can see that how people going to expose, okay. So, this kind of hazard in the region percentage wise, you can see that we have been about 50%, okay. So, the natural disaster we are exposed to that. So, if you look at the America, geophysical is 38% and then the climatology is 38%, and then rest of the place like Europe, you can see the climate and hydrologies are plays a major role. Africa again the climate and hydrology. The oceanic, those are all the percentage share with respect to global is very less. Okay. So, the people try to map this hazard and try to understand how the preparedness is happening with respect to this kind of natural hazard. So, the assessment hazard was performed using the Center for Research on Epidemic and Disaster, so AMDAT database, which has catalogued up 13,000 natural disasters worldwide since year 1900. They try to study this data and try to analyze and try to come up with that how these different countries are really affected by this hazard and also how they are prepared, how the future risk is associated with that they made a attempt. So, they found that, okay, how the exposure of the different countries to the natural hazard leading to a natural disaster. As we have seen that natural hazard is any hazard which is caused due to the nature. The natural hazard, this hazard events become a disastrous when many more people die. So, those kind of natural hazard leading to natural disaster, a continent country wise they use to map and study and given a result. So, they found that the natural hazard, okay, different country exposed. So, the dark red is used basically to show that very high level of exposure. Exposure means you can have a chance of very high level. So, the light blue one basically low level of exposure. So, if you look at the continent wise and the country wise, you can see the red mark, okay, almost like more than 50% of the world is actually having the very high level of exposure to natural hazard which lead to the natural disaster. Okay. Then the second category is actually yellow one, and then the another one is the moderate and low. So, this is like the number of events going to occur or number of people going to suffer due to the expected natural events in the entire globe. So, if you look at that, okay, the red we have seen at several places. So, you remember this color and continent, for example, you keep on the central US part, and this is very dark with respect to this one, and if you take similarly the India, so there also you have basically your so similar kind of exposure. So, but when you look at the level of risk of the different countries according to the social approach to the vulnerability, if these events are happening, how people are exposed to a risk, how people are going to be affected. So, that is again used as a like red, yellow and green and blue and then the white. So, white means basically very low risk and red means very high risk. So, if we compare again the global map with the different countries, for example, you take a US and India, you can see that US, even though these people has very high level of exposure to this natural disaster events, but they are actually very moderate to low risk region. That means the earthquake or any natural disaster comes, the people are not going to affected much. Okay. At the same time, if you see the Asia, there also the number of events occurrence also is very large, exposure also very high, the people at risk also is very high. So, mostly you can say that most of the developed countries, even though the exposure level is close to India, but the risk or danger due to these events are less, which is falls on the category of moderate and low. So, basically the developing countries like Brazil and other places like India and all other regions, you can see that they are all in the very high risk of due to this natural disaster. So, the global data has been collected for the several decades, and then it has been analyzed and plotted how this hazards, economical loss changes with every decade. So, this is from 1900 to 2000 they plotted. They found that the economical loss so keep on increasing to the year to every decade, it keep increasing in trend. So, in general, so it start at some x level, and when the decade are coming, this keep on increasing. So, this is not only because of the exposure of the people or the number of events occurring, this is because also the people economical status development. So, the economical loss due to the natural hazard keep increasing with the decade every year it is occurring. So, this happens because the reason is actually our infrastructures development on the different continent wise are different. Second, the economical and social status of the people. So, for example, the earthquake risk, it is interesting to analyze and tendency to divide the political world into two large geographical area. One is that people with in the poor countries, the people in the rich countries. So, if we divide the entire world as a poor countries and rich countries, the former ones, the human casualties are increasing throughout the centuries, but one order of the magnitude of above the rich countries. So, whereas these ones the opposite tendency observed dealing with the economical loss. So, what it means basically, for example, if the natural event of X occurred so in Asia and America, the number of people die in developing countries or Asia is actually larger than the event of the X occurred at America or rich countries, because of the our preparedness and our also the education lack in the among the people. So, for example, the X quantity of the hazard caused 100 people die in US. So, the same X minus 1 event will cause 100 people die in the Asia. So, which very clearly indicates that the similar amount of the natural hazard occurred in rich countries causes a less people to die when compared to poor countries. And if you look at a economical loss, so basically the poor countries will have half of the economical loss when compared to the rich countries, because of the currency variation as well as the per capita income. So, the number of people die due to natural hazard is very large in the poor countries or developing countries, but the economical loss is less compared to the rich and developed countries. So, which is due to the economical difference and the exposure of this one. So, the people carried out a research and collected a different type of natural hazard and tried to plot a decade wise from 1973 to 1997 decade wise. You can see that the earthquake hazard so almost causing a similar number of loss as well as the damage to the entire region when compared to any other hazard. So, that may be the reason that the other hazard basically when the growth in the scientific knowledge and development. So, the most of the other hazard we try to predict in advance, for example, cyclone. So, we try to predict in hazard, we try to minimize that by making a precautionary steps. Okay, we will evacuate a people over places where the flooding going to occur, and therein we know that there is a damage going to happen in the trees falling or building. We try to move the people because of that. So, the loss, okay, and as well as the human loss, number of people die due to other hazards are considerably less, but earthquake it is not possible to predict as on now. The number of people die that remains almost similar since its beginning. So, in fact, it increases with time. Okay. So, even though there was a very good amount of scientific development and knowledge development occurs, okay, so throughout the world, and we have in the era where all the advancement of scientific things are happening, but still this loss due to natural hazard, particularly geophysical hazard, is not preventable or minimizable, particularly in Asia it is very predominant. So, where the number of people death is very large and economical damages also considerable. So, this is because of the problem of bad use of good engineering knowledge and lack of quality control are behind these results. Okay. So, how to improve this basically, how to improve this and how to minimize the number of people die due to this kind of natural hazard. Okay. So, how to prevent this, what planning we can do. So, these are all the things we have to try to understand, which is called as a preparedness, or what we should do to this one. So, our class the next video we are going to talk about a preparedness. So, how do you do this basically? The first one is basically we try to predict any natural event, so that if you know that when it going to occur, accordingly you can take a preventive step to reduce human casualties as well as the economical loss. Okay. So, as on now I told you that it is not possible to predict a earthquake. Then the next is the preventive planning. So, how we can minimize this. So, this we will detailedly discuss in the next class.